Ghosts on film. It was the kind of thing you don't expect to happen in your own home. You hear stories, rumors about old basements, forgotten rooms, and things that don't quite add up, but you never think they'll reach your doorstep. I was 24, living alone in my parents' house after they had moved away. It had been a year since they left, a year of trying to fill the emptiness that seemed to echo through the hallways. The house was quiet, almost unnervingly so, but that was the way I liked it. I had a job, a routine, and a solid relationship with the few friends I had left in town. Things were fine. One afternoon, I ventured down to the basement. The place had always felt off. That's probably why I avoided it. The air was thick with dust and a musty smell that could only come from years of neglect. But today, something was different. I don't know if it was curiosity, or if I was simply looking for a distraction, but I found myself descending the stairs without hesitation. I'd been down there before, briefly, but I had never really explored. The clutter had always been overwhelming: boxes, old furniture, stacks of forgotten things. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw something new, a small cardboard box tucked away under a pile of old magazines. It was unusual. Most of the stuff in the basement was either discarded or too old to be of any real interest. But this box, it looked like it had been deliberately hidden. I pulled it out from under the pile, brushing off the layers of dust. The box was surprisingly heavy for its size. It had no labels, no markings, just the faintest impression of something that once belonged to someone else. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Inside was a collection of VHS tapes. Some were stacked neatly, others seemed to have been hastily thrown in. A single sheet of paper was folded in half, tucked underneath the tapes. I picked it up first, but it was blank. No handwriting, no scribbles, just an empty piece of paper. I stared at the tapes. The urge to find out what was on them hit me like a wave. I didn't know why, but I couldn't leave them there. Maybe it was the mystery, or the loneliness that had been creeping in. Maybe I was just tired of the quiet. I grabbed a tape, stuffed it into the old VCR, and sat back on the worn-out couch. The screen flickered to life. Static crackled for a moment before the image cleared up, and there it was, my house, the same house I was sitting in. I recognized the layout instantly: the living room, the staircase, the front door, but something felt off. The footage was old, grainy, like something from the 80s or 90s. There was a party going on, people I didn't recognize, strangers walking around in a place I thought I knew inside and out. I leaned in closer, squinting at the figures on the screen. The colors were strange, a little too vivid, like the tape had been tampered with. But the people, they were the strangest part. They weren't just strangers in my house, they were wrong. The faces were blurry, like they were shifting, changing, impossible to focus on. I reached for the remote, stopping the tape. The screen froze, and for a moment, all I could do was stare at it. But then, without any warning, one of the figures moved. I shot up from the couch, heart racing. What the hell? I rewound the tape, but it was gone, replaced with static. I tried to tell myself I had imagined it. It was just a trick of the light or a glitch in the tape. But something gnawed at me, some creeping feeling that I couldn't ignore. I watched the tape again, this time in a more careful silence. The strange, blurry faces were still there, but now, there was a single person standing out among the crowd. A man. He was facing the camera, and for a moment, I could swear he was staring right at me. I turned off the VCR and sat in the silence of the room. The house felt smaller somehow, as if the walls were closing in around me. The question lingered: who were these people? Why were they in my house? I thought about putting the tape back in the box, forgetting it all, but curiosity pulled me back. I had to know more. The next day, I watched the tape again, and that's when I saw it. The man from before was there again, but now there was something new. In the corner of the room, just outside the frame, a shadow moved. It was subtle, but it was there. A figure, barely visible, slipping in and out of view like it was hiding. I froze the screen, zooming in on the figure. My pulse quickened as I realized the shadow was getting closer, closer to the man, closer to the camera. My eyes darted to the VCR, and I hit play again. The figure was now standing next to the man, blending into the background, as though it had always been there. The footage continued. The people in the video were no longer static, they were shifting in and out of focus, moving closer to the camera, like they were advancing toward me. I could feel the air around me change, like something was tightening around my chest. I could almost hear their whispers in the background, muffled voices I couldn't quite make out. I didn't know how many times I watched it that night. Each time, the figures were closer, their faces clearer. But each time I rewound the tape to look for answers, the man, the one who had seemed so familiar, was closer to the screen. And the shadows, they were growing. It was too much to ignore now. The tape wasn't just footage, it was alive. The people weren't from the past. They were moving, watching me, and with each replay, they got closer, as if they were reaching out of the TV, desperate to be seen, desperate to be understood. The question was no longer who they were, but who was watching whom. I had to stop it. Had to. But something in me couldn't let go. The images, the people, they weren't just on the screen anymore. They were in my mind, inside the walls, in the house. My own house. I threw the tape across the room, but it didn't break. It didn't even look scratched. A few hours later, when the house was eerily still again, I found myself at the TV, sitting in front of the screen, staring into the darkness. The tape was gone. I could hear their whispers again. They were closer now. And they weren't just in the tape anymore. They were inside my house. I don't remember when the whispers started. It felt like they had always been there, humming in the back of my mind, just out of reach. It was only when I woke up the next morning, alone in the house, in the exact same spot on the couch, that I realized how deeply they had infected my thoughts. It wasn't just the tape anymore, it was everything. The house felt different, like the walls were watching me, shifting in ways I couldn't quite comprehend. I tried to brush it off as exhaustion, a trick of my mind after too many sleepless nights. But when I went to the kitchen to grab a cup of coffee, I found the faintest mark on the table. It was a smudge, a small, dark stain that didn't belong there. I ran my fingers over it, expecting it to be dirt or something easily explainable. But it was wet. Fresh. And it didn't feel right. I turned away from it, breathing hard, trying to shake off the unease. I hadn't been able to make sense of the tape, but I needed answers. I needed to know what was happening, what was in my own house, and why I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being hunted. The whispers came again, clearer now, louder. They seemed to seep through the cracks of the house, like air from a forgotten room. I could hear them, voices that didn't belong to anyone I knew. They were getting closer. But that wasn't the worst part. I went back to the basement, drawn by an unexplainable pull that made my skin crawl. The box was still there. But now, something was off. The contents had changed. The tape I had watched wasn't in the box. Instead, there were new tapes, more of them, stacked neatly where I had left them. They weren't marked. There was nothing to distinguish them except the sense that they were waiting for me, like they had been placed there for a purpose I hadn't yet realized. I picked one up, my heart pounding in my chest. The air in the basement felt thick now, too heavy to breathe. I could hear something moving, footsteps, soft and slow, creeping behind me. I turned quickly, but the basement was empty. Of course it was empty. I couldn't stop myself from playing the tape again. I shoved it into the VCR with trembling hands. The static flickered, then cleared, revealing the same footage. The same living room, the same party. But now, the faces weren't just shifting, they were staring. Every single one of them. Every blurry figure was fixed on the camera, staring directly at me with empty, soulless eyes. I tried to shut it off, but the remote wouldn't work. The tape continued to play, the figures on the screen growing bolder, leaning forward, their faces distorting into grotesque shapes, their mouths stretched into unnatural grins. The man I had seen before was standing at the forefront, his eyes locked onto mine. His smile widened, and I could hear his voice now, low and garbled, a sound I couldn't fully comprehend but knew was meant for me. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away. Then, suddenly, the scene shifted. The figures in the room weren't standing anymore. They were moving. They were walking, slowly, out of the frame, disappearing into the darkness of the room. But their eyes remained fixed on the screen, on me. That's when I saw it. A face, different from all the others, standing in the doorway. It wasn't blurred. It wasn't shifting. It was clear. Perfectly clear. I gasped, stumbling back from the screen as if I had been burned. The face was too familiar, so familiar it sent a cold, sickening wave of dread through me. I couldn't place it at first, but then it hit me. It was me. But it wasn't me in the way I recognized myself. It was a version of me, darker, distorted, like I had been twisted by something I couldn't even begin to understand. The figure smiled, but it wasn't the smile I knew. It was cold, devoid of warmth or humanity. I reached for the remote again, but this time, the TV shut off by itself, plunging the room into complete darkness. The basement was silent again. My breath came in short, panicked bursts as I fumbled for my phone, only to realize that it had stopped working. The screen was frozen on a picture I hadn't taken. The same face, the same distorted version of me, was staring back from the screen. I ran upstairs, the air around me growing heavier, denser. Each step felt like 1,000 pounds. The house felt suffocating now, like it was closing in around me. The walls didn't just feel like they were watching anymore. They felt alive. I tried to leave. I couldn't stay here any longer. The whispers were louder now, echoing through the house like they were coming from inside my own head. But when I reached the front door, it wouldn't open. The handle turned, but the door remained stuck, as if it had never been meant to open. I stepped back, staring at the door, my pulse racing. There was no escape. I was trapped. And as I stood there, the air grew colder. I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. Behind me, in the hallway. They were getting louder, and I could feel the weight of the house pressing in on me. I turned around, but I couldn't see anyone. Just shadows. The flicker of a figure in the corner of my eye. The whispers were more distinct now, and I could hear them speaking to me, demanding something. I didn't understand. It was all too much. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. My body refused to cooperate. But as I collapsed onto the floor, I saw it again. The figure from the tape. The one that had been watching me. It was standing in the doorway, just like it had on the screen. Only now, it was real. And it was smiling. But it wasn't smiling at all. It was grinning. I couldn't run anymore. The house had won. And somewhere, in the deepest part of the house, I could hear the faintest sound of static, just barely audible. But this time, it wasn't coming from the TV. The air in the house felt alive, buzzing with an unsettling energy that made every step feel like an intrusion. I lay there on the floor, unable to move, my limbs locked in place as the grin of the figure grew wider, more pronounced. The whispering, it was getting louder, now more distinct, as if voices were rising from every corner of the room, speaking in unison, chanting words I couldn't understand. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were demands. My mind raced, searching for an escape, any way to break free from this nightmare, but the house was no longer a place I recognized. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, they seemed to shift and breathe, as though the house itself was alive, feeding off the tension that coursed through me. I tried to scream, to force myself to shout, but my voice was swallowed by the thick silence that followed the whispers. I couldn't make a sound. The figure, the one from the tape, the one that had been smiling at me, was still there, motionless in the doorway, but now, it wasn't alone. There were others, more of them, standing in the shadows just out of sight. They were barely visible, flickering in and out of existence like bad static on a TV. Their eyes, just like in the footage, locked on me, unblinking, watching with a cold intensity that made my skin crawl. Their presence was suffocating, pushing in from every direction, filling the space until it felt like I couldn't breathe. The figure that had been closest to the door now moved. Slow. Methodical. It took a step forward, its grin stretching even further. The sound of its movements, if they could even be called that, was like the scraping of metal on metal, like nails on a chalkboard. But I couldn't look away. It was me. It had my face, but it was twisted, distorted, like some kind of broken reflection. It moved closer, until it was standing over me, its face looming above mine. And that's when I saw it, the thing that I had refused to acknowledge all this time. Behind the grin, behind the eyes that never blinked, there was a flicker of recognition. It was like the face was trying to speak, to tell me something, but no words came out. Only the hollow, empty laugh that seemed to vibrate through the air, thickening it around me. The voices, no, the chants, were getting louder, pulsing in rhythm with the laugh. I couldn't take it anymore. My hands finally moved, desperate to pull myself away, to get out, but it was as though the house itself was holding me in place. I couldn't push myself up from the floor, couldn't crawl towards the door, the window, any way out. Every part of me was frozen, pinned down by some invisible force. I turned my head slightly, trying to see if there was any way to escape, but that's when I saw it. In the far corner of the room, something new had appeared. Another figure. It was obscured at first, just a shadow in the distance. But then, as if it stepped out of the very walls themselves, it became clear. It was a woman, her face pale, eyes wide and vacant, the skin on her arms stretched too tight, as though it was holding her together by sheer will. She was looking at me. Her eyes were empty, but they were also familiar. I didn't know her, but I felt like I should. I felt like I had seen her before, in a dream or some distant memory I couldn't quite grasp. Her mouth opened slowly, and I could see that her lips moved, forming words that never quite reached my ears. It was as if the words were trapped in her throat, unable to be released. The room around me began to shift. The walls, which had seemed so solid just moments ago, now warped and writhed like the skin of some great beast. The ceiling cracked open with a sound that sent vibrations through my bones, revealing an impossible darkness above, swallowing the light. I could feel it, though. I could feel the presence of something greater, something much darker, moving around me. The house had been waiting for me. The figure, the woman, everything. They weren't just from the tapes. They had always been here, and they were getting closer. Not just in the tapes, but in my life. I had let them in, and now I was trapped. There was nowhere to go. The figure that had been closest to me, the one with my face, reached down, its hand hovering just above my own. It was cold, colder than ice, and when it touched me, I felt it in my chest, a sudden rush of panic, of knowing. The moment its fingers made contact, I saw the tapes again, the way they had been when I first found them, but this time, they were different. They weren't just recordings. They were memories. Mine. Every moment, every flicker of time, replaying in front of me. My childhood, my parents, the house, my life, but they weren't the memories I had. They were twisted, distorted, showing things I never experienced, things that had happened before me, things that were being lived out by people I could never recognize. And then, the worst realization hit me like a brick to the chest. The people on the tape, the ones that had been watching me, weren't just figures from the past. They were people who had been here before. And now, they were starting to take me. The woman in the corner moved closer, her eyes now locked on mine, her mouth finally opening. But this time, I didn't hear any words. I didn't need to. I understood. I was already part of the tape. I was already part of them. And as the last shred of my strength slipped away, I realized that the tape wasn't just a story. It was a trap. And I was the next one to disappear. The room began to pulse with an energy I couldn't understand, like the very walls of the house were breathing, in rhythm with the hollow laugh that echoed from the figure standing above me. The edges of my vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I was slipping away, into a dream, into darkness, into oblivion. But then, the pain came. A sharp, burning sensation ran through my chest, making my heart race, making it feel like I was being torn apart from the inside. The woman's face, the one in the corner, the one with the vacant eyes, was now inches from mine. I could smell the rot of her skin, the sourness of something far older than I was. Her lips moved, and again, I could hear nothing. The words were silent, locked away in that void between us, but I felt them. I felt them deep inside me, unraveling something I had never even known existed. I could feel my body fighting against the invisible force that held me in place. My muscles screamed in protest, but I couldn't break free. The laughter, that grin, it was all around me now. The figure with my face stepped back, but only for a second. It was as if it knew, as if it was waiting for something. Waiting for me to understand. The voices, they had grown louder, more distinct, now a chorus of whispers and laughs and cries, all blending together into something incomprehensible, suffocating. The air itself seemed to thicken, swirling with the sound of their presence. I tried to scream again, but my throat was tight, my mouth dry. My voice was nothing more than a rasping whisper, swallowed by the thickening air. Desperation gripped me like a vice, and in that moment, I realized the horrible truth. The house wasn't just a place anymore. It wasn't just some building I had lived in. It was alive. And it had been watching me, waiting for me. I had stepped into its trap, unknowingly. But now that I knew, now that I saw it for what it was, there was no way out. And then, I saw it. A shadow flickered across the floor, stretching unnaturally long. The figures, the ones from the tape, were all around me now, moving closer. They weren't just watching anymore. They were coming. The woman's mouth opened wider, her voice finally reaching my ears, but it wasn't a voice, not really. It was a feeling, a presence, creeping into my mind, pushing against the edges of my thoughts. "You're one of us now," she whispered, but it wasn't her voice. It wasn't her at all. It was something older, something that had been there, waiting. "We are the house. And the house is you." Her eyes bored into mine, and I realized, too late, that I had been blind. The house, the tapes, the figures that had watched me, all of it had been leading to this. I wasn't just an observer of these strange events anymore. I was part of them. I had always been part of them. As if in response to her words, the tape player clicked, the hum of its motor filling the room. I hadn't even noticed it had started again, but there it was, turning itself over, feeding its images back into the room like some kind of haunting ritual. The screen flickered to life, the familiar footage playing out, only now, the faces were different. They were mine. I could see myself, standing there, watching the tape, just like I had before. But something had changed. I wasn't alone anymore. I was surrounded by the figures, all of them moving, closing in, their eyes locked on me, no longer distant, no longer ghosts in the shadows. They were alive. And they were all looking at me, just as I had looked at them before. The figures in the tape weren't separate from me, they were me. I was them. And then, everything shifted. The air became cold. So cold that I could see my breath in the dim light. The shadows grew longer, the walls seemed to lean in, closer, as if they were going to crush me. The figure that had my face, it moved again. Its grin stretched wider, impossibly wider, until its mouth opened, and I saw nothing. An endless void behind its teeth, a blackness that swallowed the room whole. The others, those who had been watching, those who had been waiting, stepped forward, and I could feel the weight of their eyes, pressing down on me. The woman was the last to move. She reached out, her hand hovering over my chest, just like the figure had done before, but now it wasn't just a touch. It was a pull, a force that seemed to rip the very essence of me out of my body, drawing me into that dark space, into the void where there was no time, no reality. It was as if I was being sucked into the tape itself, into the very thing I had tried so hard to escape. And then, I was no longer in the room. I was back in the house, but it wasn't my house anymore. The walls were covered in cracks, the windows shattered, the air thick with decay. The figures, my figures, were everywhere, watching, waiting. They had always been there, lurking in the corners of the rooms, hidden in the shadows, behind the tape, behind the lens. I realized with a sickening clarity that I had become a part of it all. There was no escape. No leaving. And as the laughter returned, louder this time, overwhelming, the last thing I heard was the voice from the woman. Her whisper, her breath in my ear. "Welcome home." And that was when I knew. I wasn't just a part of the house anymore. I was a part of the tape.